She was 28 years old, and by the time the leaves turned that October, she had exactly $11 to her name and no roof she could call her own. Her uncle, Simon Trask, the only family she had left in the world, had sold the boarding house out from under her while she was away nursing a sick neighbor, pocketed the proceeds, and told her plainly that a woman on her own was a debt he no longer intended to carry. With her $11 folded into the toe of her boot, she found herself standing at the edge of the river in the small town of Millbrook Landing, staring at a half-sunken ferry dock that the town had abandoned years before. Its pilings rotted, its planks green with algae, a place so worthless that the county had stopped even listing it on the tax rolls. She paid $7 for it, and the men on the porch of the mercantile laughed loud enough that she heard it clear across the water, calling her a fool for buying a dock that couldn't even hold a rowboat steady. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know as she stood ankle-deep in river mud counting out her coins, was that beneath those rotting planks lay a sealed chest that would not only change the course of her own life, but would quietly restore something the whole town of Millbrook Landing had lost without ever realizing it was gone. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Ann Carrow, if you've ever been told that what you chose to save wasn't worth saving. Tell us where you're watching from tonight, because this story is for you. Josephine Carrow had been born in 1859 in a river town in western Pennsylvania, the only daughter of a ferryman named Elias Carrow and his wife Ruth, who together had spent nearly 2 decades running a small crossing over the Allegheny before consumption took Ruth in the winter of Josephine's 12th year, and a flatboat accident took Elias 4 years after that, leaving Josephine, at 16, to be taken in by her mother's brother, Simon Trask, a man who ran a modest boarding house in the same river town and who took her in less out of affection than out of the practical understanding that a niece who could cook, clean, and keep books was cheaper than hired help. It was, in a strange way, her father's trade that shaped her most deeply, even though she never worked a ferry crossing herself. Elias Carrow had been a meticulous man despite his rough hands and his weathered face. A man who understood that a ferry was only as trustworthy as the person who maintained it. And he had taught Josephine, in the years before his death, the patient art of reading a structure the way other men read a book, how to press a thumb into old wood and know by the give whether the rot was surface deep or bone deep, how to judge the strength of a piling by the sound it made when struck, how to see, in a thing that looked ruined to every casual eye, the difference between what was truly finished and what merely looked finished to someone who hadn't troubled to look closely. Most folks, he used to tell her, sitting on the dock in the evenings with his pipe, give up on a thing the moment it looks bad, because looking bad is easy to see and being useless takes work to prove. Don't you ever confuse the two. Ruth, for her part, had given Josephine something quieter but no less useful, a deep, unshowy patience, learned from years of running a household on a ferryman's uncertain wages, an ability to make something out of very little and to do it without complaint, because complaint, Ruth used to say, spends energy you'll need later for the actual mending at Simon Trask's boarding house. Josephine spent 12 years doing the work of 3 people for the security, such as it was, of a roof and a bed, cooking for the boarders, keeping the ledgers with the same honest precision her father had valued, mending linens, and quietly absorbing the small daily indignities of a man who considered her presence a favor he was doing her rather than the labor keeping his business afloat. She had in those years one genuine friend in the town, a widow named Della Ashworth who ran the town's small dry goods store and who had known Josephine's mother well enough to remember and speak of the woman Josephine so rarely got to hear about from anyone else. Della was perhaps 55, sharp-eyed and plain-spoken, the kind of woman the town relied on more than it ever properly thanked. And it was Della who first noticed, long before Josephine herself fully registered it, that Simon Trask had begun quietly courting a buyer for the boarding house behind his niece's back. A fat Della mentioned gently one afternoon over a length of muslin. Not to alarm Josephine, but because she believed rightly that a woman deserved to know when the ground beneath her was shifting. The winter Josephine turned 28, brought both an early frost and a fever that swept through the smaller households along the river. And when the Pruitt family 2 streets over lost their eldest boy to it, and the mother herself fell gravely ill, Josephine, who had nursed her own mother through a similar sickness years before and knew the small mercies that could ease a fever's worst hours, went to sit with Mrs. Pruitt for what became nearly 3 weeks, cooking broth, changing linens, and sitting through the long nights so the exhausted father could sleep. She did this without asking Simon Trask's permission, because she had never imagined she needed it, and it was during those 3 weeks, while she was occupied with a genuine act of mercy, that Simon Trask quietly finalized the sale of the boarding house to a merchant from the county seat, packed his own belongings, and by the time Josephine returned, thin and drained from her nursing but glad at least that Mrs. Pruitt had survived, she found the boarding house locked, her own trunk of belongings sitting outside the door in the rain, and a note from her uncle informing her that the sale was final, that he had taken lodging elsewhere, and that he considered his obligation to her, as he put it, fully discharged. The new owner, a stranger with no particular unkindness in him, but no obligation either, allowed Josephine one night's shelter out of simple decency, and made it clear the following morning that he had no need of the arrangement continuing. Josephine stood on the porch of the only home she had known for 12 years with her trunk, her mother's small cedar sewing box, and $11 that represented the entirety of small personal savings she had managed to set aside from years of wages. Her uncle had always called generous and had never once actually been. Della Ashworth offered her a place to stay without hesitation, and Josephine was deeply grateful for it. But she was a proud woman in the way her father had been proud, uninterested in living indefinitely on another's charity, and she began, within days, to think seriously about what she might do with the little she had. It was Della, in fact, who first mentioned the old ferry dock at the bend below Millbrook Landing, a town some 8 miles downriver where Josephine had occasional acquaintance through her father's old ferry connections, telling her, half as gossip and half as genuine information, that the town had abandoned its old dock years before when a new bridge made the crossing unnecessary, and that the county, tired of the liability, was practically giving the property away to be rid of the obligation of tearing it down. Josephine traveled to Millbrook Landing on a gray D.I.N.P. morning in November, carrying her $11 and the particular kind of hope that comes only after a person has run out of other options. The dock, when she found it, was exactly as decrepit as she had been warned. A long, low structure of graying timber extending out over water that had partially reclaimed the far end of it. Pilings green with river moss. The small dockmaster's shack at the landward end, missing half its roof and most of its windows. The county clerk, a tired, overworked man named Otis Kern, who had clearly been trying to unload the liability off his books for years, told her frankly that she could have the whole parcel, dock and shack and the narrow strip of riverbank it sat on, for $7, simply to be rid of the annual cost of insuring against the thing collapsing on some unlucky fisherman. Josephine walked out onto those planks herself before she agreed to anything, testing them the way her father had taught her, pressing her weight carefully at each joint, and found to her quiet satisfaction that while the outer third of the dock had indeed rotted past saving, the landward 2/3, the pilings closest to shore, were sound underneath their ugly weathered surface, driven deep into good clay bottom and built, whoever had built them, with real skill. She paid her $7, and the men lounging on the mercantile porch across the road, who had watched the whole exchange with the particular amusement small towns reserve for a stranger's foolishness, laughed loudly enough that the sound carried clear across the water, one of them calling out that she'd need a rowboat just to reach the good half of her own property. Asterisk. Josephine did not answer them. She had learned, in 12 years under her uncle's roof, that answering mockery rarely changed its mind and only cost you your own composure. And so she simply gathered her skirts, walked the sound 2/3 of her new dock back to the shack, and began, that same afternoon, the unglamorous work of making a ruin livable. Sweeping out years of leaves and river debris, patching the roof with scrap boards she found stacked behind the shack, and settling in for her first night as the owner, however dubious, of a piece of Millbrook Landing that nobody else had wanted. It was on her third day, while she was prying up a section of rotted flooring in the shack in hopes of salvaging the sounder boards beneath for repairs elsewhere, that her crowbar caught on something that did not give the way old flooring should. Something solid and metallic beneath a final layer of boards that had clearly been laid. She realized upon closer inspection, more deliberately than the haphazard construction around them, fitted with a care that stood out amid the general shabbiness of the place, that it took her the better part of an hour, working patiently in the gray afternoon light with only her crowbar and her bare hands, to fully clear away the boards concealing what lay beneath the shack's floor. And when she finally succeeded, she found herself kneeling before a small iron-banded sea chest, its wood dark with age but remarkably intact, sealed with a simple hasp-lock that had rusted enough that a firm strike with a stone broke it open without much trouble. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilskin that had kept the damp at bay far better than anything else in that ruined shack, she found a leather-bound ledger, a bundle of letters tied with waxed twine, and a small canvas pouch that, when she opened it, revealed not a fortune in coin, as some desperate corner of her had half hoped, but something she would come to understand, in the weeks that followed, was worth far more to the town of Millbrook Landing than any sum of money could have been. The ledger, once she had carried it back to her small lamp in the shack and begun carefully turning its brittle pages, told the story of a man named Nathaniel Weir, who had built and run the Millbrook Ferry crossing some 40 years before, and who had also, the ledger made clear, served for nearly a decade as the informal keeper of what the townsfolk of that era had called the River Bend Mutual Aid Society, a modest cooperative fund into which the fishing families, ferrymen, and small farmers along that stretch of river had each contributed a portion of their earnings, to be drawn upon whenever hardship struck one of their own, whether from a lost season's catch, a barn fire, or a sudden illness that left a family unable to work. The letters, once Josephine worked through their careful, formal handwriting, told a harder story, that in the final years of the fund's operation, a wealthy landowner from the county seat named Augustus Calloway, who had been quietly buying up river-adjacent farmland for a planned rail spur, had pressured Nathaniel Weir, through a combination of loans he controlled and threats he never quite spoke aloud, to divert a substantial portion of the mutual aid fund into financing Calloway's land purchases, with the understanding, or so Calloway had promised, that the fund would be repaid in full once the rail spur brought its expected profits. The rail spur, as it happened, had never been built, the route rerouted through another county for reasons of politics rather than practicality, and Calloway had simply absorbed the fund's contributions into his own considerable and growing estate, leaving Nathaniel Weir holding the shame of having betrayed his neighbor's trust. Whether willingly or under duress, the letters did not entirely make clear, though Weir's own final entries in the ledger suggested a man tormented by what he had allowed to happen, unable to face the town he had failed, and equally unable to summon the courage to expose a man as powerful as Calloway. Weir had died. The ledger's final entry suggested in a hand grown shaky in the autumn of 1849, not long after sealing this chest beneath his own dockmaster's shack floor, with a final note addressed simply to whoever might one day find it. He had managed, in his last months, to recover a portion of the diverted funds from Calloway through a private settlement. Calloway had agreed to avoid public scandal. Coin which Weir had hidden alongside the ledger and letters rather than risk depositing it anywhere Calloway's considerable influence might reach. Intending to restore it to the Mutual Aid Society himself once he found the courage to face the town's judgment. A reckoning death had apparently overtaken before he ever managed it. The canvas pouch. Josephine now understood with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold river air seeping through the shack's broken windows, contained that very recovered sum, modest by any grand standard, but substantial for a small river town. Sitting untouched and unclaimed for nearly 40 years, beneath the floor everyone had long since forgotten to think about, Josephine sat with that chest open before her lamp for a long while that night, turning over in her mind not merely the money itself, but the weight of what Nathaniel Weir's unfinished conscience had left behind. An old debt to a community that had trusted him, and a name, Augustus Calloway, that meant nothing to her yet but would, she suspected, mean a great deal to whoever in Millbrook Landing remembered that era. She thought of her own father's hands pressing into old wood, of his voice telling her never to confuse looking ruined with being finished, and she understood. Kneeling there in that broken shack with her mother's sewing box beside her and $7 worth of dock creaking gently in the current outside, that she had not simply bought a worthless pier. She had inherited, quite by accident, an old town's unpaid debt to itself. The difficulty facing Josephine was one she turned over carefully in the days that followed, because the name Augustus Calloway, she quickly learned from a cautious conversation with Otis Kern at the county office, was not merely a name from 40 years past, but very much a living one. The son of the original Calloway having inherited both his father's land and, it seemed, a considerable portion of his father's instinct for using money and influence to smooth over inconvenient history. A man named Thaddeus Calloway, who now sat on the very county board that had sold Josephine her dock, and who, Kern mentioned in a lowered voice, was known to take a personal and unfriendly interest in anything that threatened the polished respectability of the Calloway name. Josephine understood, with the same patient clarity her father had taught her to bring to a rotted piling, that she could not simply walk into town waving an old ledger and expect to be believed over a family that had spent 40 years cultivating exactly the kind of trust she was about to challenge. So she did what she had always done when faced with something larger than her own. Strength could manage outright. She gathered facts, quietly and carefully, before she ever raised her voice. She began with Della Ashworth, who, though not from Millbrook Landing herself, knew several older families along that stretch of river through her own trade connections, and who helped Josephine identify and gently approach the handful of families whose names appeared in Weir's old ledger as original contributors to the Mutual Aid Fund. She found, in the weeks that followed, an elderly waterman named Cyrus Boyle, well into his 70s now, who remembered his own father speaking bitterly, in his final years, of money the family had once given freely and never seen again, though the family had long assumed it was simply lost to hard times rather than deliberately diverted. She found a woman named Prudence Yates, whose grandmother had been a founding contributor to the fund and who had kept, tucked inside an old family Bible for reasons she herself could no longer fully explain, a faded receipt for a contribution made in 1847, a piece of paper that matched, almost to the exact date, an entry in Weir's own ledger. Slowly, patiently, over nearly a month of careful conversation, Josephine assembled a picture that mirrored the ledger's account with an uncomfortable precision. Families who remembered giving, and giving in good faith. Money that had simply vanished from the town's memory, along with the man who had been trusted to keep it safe. Asterisk. It was predictably impossible for a stranger to spend A month asking pointed questions about the Calloway family's history. In a town as small and interconnected as Millbrook Landing, without word eventually reaching Thaddeus Calloway himself, and when it did, he did not wait for Josephine to bring her questions to him directly. He arrived at her ramshackle dock on a cold, overcast afternoon in his fine dark coat, a man in his 50s with the smooth, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to having disputes resolved in his favor before they properly began. And he told her, with a courtesy that did not quite disguise its underlying threat, that he understood she had been asking odd questions around town about matters better left to rest with the dead, and that a woman in her position, alone, without property beyond a rotting dock, without family standing behind her, would be wise to consider how such questions might be received by people with far more influence than she possessed. He suggested, not quite directly but close enough that the meaning could not be mistaken, that continuing down this path might make her already precarious situation considerably more difficult. That county liens had a way of finding property owners who made themselves inconvenient, and that he would hate to see a woman of otherwise sensible character bring hardship upon herself over old gossip that could not possibly be proven. Josephine listened to the entirety of this, without interruption, the way her mother had taught her to let an angry man exhaust his own bluster before answering. And when he had finished, she told him, in a voice that did not waver, that she had not come to Millbrook Landing looking for old gossip, but had found, quite by accident, a ledger and a set of letters in her own late husband's late employer's hand, and that she would be glad to discuss the matter further, in full, before the county board at its next public session, alongside the families whose names appeared in that ledger. She had, in fact, invented no husband, but she found in that moment that naming the discovery as something inherited, rather than something she had gone hunting for, gave Calloway less certain ground to stand on, and something in her steady refusal to be moved unsettled him visibly more than any direct accusation could have. He left without another word, though Josephine understood clearly, watching his carriage pull away down the muddy road, that she had made for the first time in her adult life a genuine and formidable enemy, and that he would not simply allow the matter to rest quietly. In the 2 weeks that followed, Calloway moved to protect himself as men of his standing generally did, quietly suggesting to certain members of the county board that the whole affair was the invention of a destitute, possibly unstable woman looking to extort money from a respected local family by fabricating documents nobody could verify. And Josephine felt the mood of the town shift uneasily beneath her, felt the same sideways glances and murmured doubts that had greeted her purchase of the dock, now curdling into something sharper and more dangerous. She might have lost her nerve entirely under that pressure, alone as she was, if not for the quiet, steady support of the small circle of allies she had gathered. Della Ashworth, who vouched for her character without hesitation; Cyrus Boyle, whose memory of his father's old bitterness had only sharpened once he understood its true cause; Prudence Yates, whose faded receipt sat now as tangible proof beside Weir's ledger entries; and unexpectedly, Otis Kern himself, the county clerk, who had grown increasingly troubled in the course of quietly verifying old land records at Josephine's request by discrepancies he found between the Calloway family's public account of their fortune and the actual timeline of their land acquisitions, discrepancies that lined up with uncomfortable precision against the very years the mutual aid fund had gone missing. The county board's public session was set for the second week of December, held in the largest room available, the Millbrook Landing meeting hall, packed well beyond its usual capacity once word of the dispute had spread along the whole river valley. Josephine arrived with Weir's original ledger, the bundle of letters, Prudence Yates's receipt, and the quiet, steadying presence of Della Cyrus and Prudence standing beside her, along with Otis Kern's carefully assembled land records. Thaddeus Calloway arrived with 2 hired attorneys and the confident, bearing of a man who did not believe a river town would ever truly turn against his family's name. But when Josephine read Nathaniel Weir's own final, anguished entries aloud to that packed hall, a dead man's unfinished conscience speaking plainly across 40 years of silence, and when she followed it by reading, name after name, the ledger's account of every family who had trusted their earnings to a fund that had quietly vanished into Calloway land, many of those very families sitting in the hall and recognizing their own grandparents' names, a stillness fell over that room unlike anything Millbrook Landing had witnessed in living memory. A stillness made total when Otis Kern stood, visibly uneasy but resolute, and confirmed that the county's own land records matched, acre for acre and year for year, the exact pattern the ledger described. Thaddeus Calloway, faced with his own family's history laid bare before the descendants of the very people it had wronged, found that his attorney's careful objections could not survive the weight of that silence, and in the face of it, he had nothing left to offer. The board, shaken by how completely the town's trust had been misplaced for 2 generations, acted with unusual speed once the truth stood undeniable before them. Calloway was compelled, under the county's own authority and the very real threat of a public suit the family could not afford to have dragged through open court, to surrender a sum equivalent to the original diverted funds, adjusted with reasonable interest from his own considerable land holdings, a settlement he accepted quietly rather than risk further exposure. That restored sum, combined with the coin Nathaniel Weir himself had recovered and hidden away in his final months, was placed under a newly formed River Valley Relief Committee, with Josephine herself invited, at the near-unanimous insistence of the family she had helped, to sit among its founding members alongside Cyrus, Boyle, and Prudence Yates. The funds were disbursed that winter to families across the valley who needed them, including a sum that finally allowed old Cyrus Boyle to replace a fishing boat that had been failing him for years, and Nathaniel Weir, whose name had been quietly forgotten rather than deliberately blackened, was given a modest but heartfelt recognition, a small marker placed near the rebuilt dock honoring him as the man who, whatever his failures in life, had spent his final months trying, however imperfectly, to make things right. Josephine spent that following spring rebuilding the sound 2/3 of her dock properly, replacing rotted boards with fresh timber, reinforcing the pilings her father's teaching had told her were worth saving, and by summer the little crossing, which the town had begun calling Carrow's Landing without much formal discussion, was doing steady, modest business ferrying goods and passengers across a bend in the river, too awkward for the newer bridge to fully serve. Its books kept as honestly and precisely as her father had once kept his own accounts. She never sought out her Uncle Simon Trask to demand any reckoning for how he had cast her aside, deciding, in the same quiet way she decided most things, that some debts were better left to settle themselves than chased at the cost of her own peace. Though she did, every November on the anniversary of the day she'd pried up that shack floor, walk out to the small marker near the water and sit with it a while, remembering the man whose quiet, unfinished conscience had asked nothing more of her than to finish what he could not. And so we return, as we always do, to where this story began, a 28-year-old woman, cast out with $11 in a trunk, who bought a sinking, mocked, forgotten ferry dock at the edge of a town that had already decided what she was worth, what the men laughing from that mercantile porch could not see, and what Josephine herself did not yet know as she counted out her $7, was that the true value of that ruined dock had nothing to do with tolls or timber or even the coin hidden beneath its rotted floor. Its true value lay in the unfinished promise of a man 40 years gone, a promise that trust, once broken, does not have to stay broken forever, even if it takes 4 decades and one overlooked woman with a crowbar to finally set it right. Josephine Carrow did not set out to topple a powerful family or recover a lost fortune or clear a dead ferryman's conscience. She set out, simply, to make something of the only thing anyone would sell her, and in doing so, she gave an entire river valley back a debt it hadn't even realized was still owed. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Josephine's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And let us know in the comments, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of your stories, and we treasure them. Until next time, stay close, **.